so that it's not quite as bright. Maybe, let's see. Whoops, that's not what we want. We want that. How does that work?
That's good.
Okay.
That's all the light you have, right?
The light right behind me that might be a little distracting. Let me turn that one off and turn on some of the side.
Okay, great.
All right, how are we doing now?
I'm just getting Arden to look at it too.
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So we'll talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll just create sort of the best 3 or 4 minutes of this, and make it live right when your book is out. So you did a great job. Congrats on that.
Thank you.
So I know, obviously that there's the play, but it's clear that this book involved quite a bit of research and reporting, and it seems to me, just from having read the book, that it might have been kind of exciting. What was the research like for you?
Well, it began as a play, and I went down to Plains to interview the Carters, and then I went to Israel and Egypt and interviewed all the surviving members of those delegations. And then, the usual, reading all the source material, and for me, putting it all on note cards. That's just outlining and that kind of thing, which I did for the play. I realized when I finished the play that the book I would have adapted didn't exist. So that's how this book evolved.
And so was everybody at this remove of time pretty honest and willing to talk about all this, or were their feelings still kind of raw?
Well, there are still there are big differences in the interpretation of the Camp David Accords that persist to this day, especially between Carter and members of the Israeli delegation. According to President Carter, Menachem Begin, the Israeli Prime Minister, had agreed to stop settlement construction in the West Bank, and for as long as the negotiations over the Palestinian portion of the Accords were going on. Begin, as soon as the conference was over, denied that. And as Carter told me, as soon as he got back to civilization, he began to lie about it. He feels very bitter about that. Members of the Israeli delegation say that Begin would never have agreed to that all he agreed to was a 3-month suspension while the negotiations were going on with the Egyptians to finalize the accords. I've looked at the documents. There were 23 drafts that were done of the American proposal during that period of time, and the settlement suspension is always in the Palestinian portion of those accords rather than the Israeli-Egyptian. So I think if you're looking at just documentary evidence, Carter has it right. And
so Carter was willing and ready to talk about all this?
Well, the producer of the play, Gerald Rafshoon, was Carter's media advisor, and was his dream all along. He wanted to make a movie of Camp David, but finally he decided to ask me to write a play that the Arena Stage commissioned in Washington, D.C. So he and I went down to Plains together and went to that very modest house that Jimmy and Rosalind Carter built in the early 1950s when he retired from the Navy and went home to take over the peanut warehouse. I mean, it's a very modest, almost a tract house. And President and Mrs. Carter were sitting on this chintz couch with their matching chintz curtains, and a painting behind them that Jimmy had painted It was sort of a goodnight moon type of painting. And Rafshoon says, Mr. President, Larry works for the New Yorker. He recently wrote an article about Scientology. Oh, I read that. I found it most intriguing. And Rosalind turns to him and says, "Since when did you start reading the New Yorker?" And I read it every week. And suddenly I realized that was Rosalind was going to be my fourth character in my play. She turned out to be very, very helpful to this project, and she gave me something that I really treasure, which is her personal diary of the Camp David experience. It turned out to be very useful to me.
Yeah. And so I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, in the current war, what would have to happen for peace talks even to begin?
Well, they have to actually talk about peace. The collapse of the American project recently, it failed because they were talking about prisoner swaps. That's important, but it's in some ways irrelevant to the question of peace. Peace is going to depend on fundamentally resolving the issues between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and they are the question of whether Palestinian refugees can return, or what would that look like? The resolution of the issue of Jerusalem. Israel sees it as its capital, but it's also very important to the Palestinians. And then the borders, what kind of state are we talking about? Israel doesn't have determined borders right now, and nor does the nominal Palestinian entity. So where do we draw the line? When those kinds of issues are seriously addressed, then we will have peace in the Middle East, but not until the politicians on both sides are willing to make the domestic sacrifices they have to make in order to obtain peace.
One of the great things about this book is that Begun and Sadat are these kind of larger-than-life characters, almost too large for life, because you don't know if their own myths about themselves are, how much of that is true. But I was the most interested in President Carter because, what I remember about the way that his presidency was perceived at the time is that he was perceived as being kind of toothless, and maybe not, the best president, period. But, he comes across in your book much more courageous and even shrewd than the public perceived him, I think, at the time. Why do you think there was this gap in perception for him?
Well, Carter, he was very popular when he was elected. In fact, his approval rating, his popularity was higher than Ronald Reagan ever achieved. But it was like the Alps. It just went downhill from there. And part of it was the economy stunk. He inherited a very bad economy, and it didn't improve for a long time. He was an unlucky president. Things didn't always turn out well for him. The Iran-Contra situation was a perfect example. He didn't have the likability quotient that Reagan had to ride those kinds of things out. People want to believe in their president's juju, and Carter just didn't have that. And yet, he was a very effective governor, and I think a capable president given the limitations politically that he had. But he just didn't have the likability that would carry him through some of those rough patches. And then he was faced with, a titanic opponent in Ronald Reagan, who was perhaps the most likable president we've ever had. So, those kinds of things conspired to bring him down. But it was interesting to go back and recalibrate his presidency in light of what was really one of the great triumphs of diplomacy in the 20th century. And he got so little credit for it. I think because he just didn't have the popularity to be able to float that.
Yeah. And so, did you get the sense that he liked a reporter sort of coming back and, asking him questions about this? Because it clearly is something he worked hard at.
No, he was he was willing enough to sit down. I had come all the way down to Plains, and so we spent time together. But the truth is, he's very conservative with his time. And for me to try to get follow-up questions and things like that, it was really pulling teeth from him. And Raf Shum said I spent more time with him than any other reporter ever has. I don't know if that's true, but it wasn't as much time as I would like to have had with him. He's parsimonious with his time, and he believes that it's all been written before and people have said things, and he's moved on. However, if you start engaging him about the questions of the settlements, and he's still very, very engaged with that. And of course, he's still involved in the Middle East, and he frequently makes trips there. He's deeply tied into the Palestinians and people in the Israeli community.
Yeah, I mean, he's probably our most thoughtful ex-president. I mean, he's writing books all the time, and weighing in with ideas that go against whoever's in charge at the time.
He's an iconoclast. He really is, and the other thing, people like him as an ex-president. It's funny that all the stuff that would have helped him as president he has now, but he didn't have it then. But he's the same man now as he was when he was president. It's just that he didn't show those advantage to his best advantage.
Yeah. And so I want to ask you just about the structure of the book. The structuring it around the various days seems like a sort of elemental and natural structure. Did you always know that it would be sort of laid out that way, or how did that work for you?
Well, I came of age in early John McPhee, so the great structuralist, and structure has always been a friend and an enemy. If you're too structured, then you don't have room to roam and as a writer. And in this case, though, we're dealing with very complex material. And I realized that 13 days of the summit would form the architecture of the book, the overall architecture, day by day. But there were two other chronologies in the book that I had to string through it. One was the history of the modern Middle East, seen through the eyes of the people that were actually at Camp David. Menachem Begin, Moshe Dayan, Ezra Weizman in the Israeli delegation, for instance. These were the people that in many respects created modern Israel. And then on the Egyptian side, you had Anwar Sadat and Osama Elbaz, the chief negotiator, and people that were very engaged with making Egypt and bringing Egypt into the modern world. So those people, you can't look at the modern Middle East without seeing their contribution. I made a rule for myself that the history of the Middle East was going to move in a linear, sequential fashion, just as those 13 days did. And then under that are the tectonic plates of the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran. And I've tried as much as possible to have that sequence be linear as well, so that you're moving through time, three different time periods simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things the book does nicely is at least for a lot of American readers, I mean, is the whole conflict now is so confusing, and I think largely because we don't understand the history. I mean, the people who live there may understand it more than we do, but it is a nice primer on the history. So good work on that.
Thank you.
So you've written about high-level politics and matters of state before. I mean, I admire your career because you write about a bunch of different things. But why does this kind of topic keep interesting you?
Well, Clay, I lived in Egypt for a couple of years when I was a young man. I taught at the American University in Cairo, and I spoke some Arabic. And then during my reporting career, I, I find myself going to the Middle East many times. I've done a lot of reporting in Israel. Uh, and so, and I spent some time in Gaza, which is a subject that's, preoccupying us these days. Um, the plight of those people is so arresting to me. These are two very, very similar people caught in a kind of death grip that just goes on for generation after generation. And my heart goes out to them. At the same time, I get so impatient with it. Sometimes I cannot believe that this is endured. I am 66 years old. I'm the same age as Israel. And it's fascinating to me to think, there's this sense that this conflict will endure forever. And yet, in my lifetime, I grew up in the segregated South, and now we have a black man who's president. I've seen apartheid disappear, the Soviet Union, the Cold War go away. Uh, History does change and can change. But when you get in the Middle East, you have a sense that you're on an iceberg, and it will never melt. It's just that perception, though, is one of the big obstacles to creating peace.
Yeah. Last question. You have been a journalist, playwright, actor, screenwriter. Is there, I mean, obviously, you take the role that's right for the work of art that you're working on at the time. But is there one of those that you prefer?
It's the one that I'm not doing at the time.
Great. Okay. No, that's actually a perfect answer.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So good work on the book, and hope to see you at. Or when do you have an event here in town for
Yeah,
it?
I do Book People somewhere along the line, and I'll do the book festival as well.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, cool. Well, good work on it, and we'll work on this and get it ready for your pub day.
Thank you so much, Clay. Take
Okay.
care.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.